Down to Earth. We're going to be talking about a very important topic in all of trauma, which is gun violence as it affects populations, particularly in North America. And I just want to mention in my closing remarks what a great honor it is to have this lecture in the Department of Surgery named after Marv Tile, who's on the line with us this morning. And it's great to see Marv and to recognize all that he's done in the fields of orthopedics and trauma throughout his entire career. So Marv, thanks for joining us today, and I'll turn the podium now over to Avery.
Thanks so much, Jim, and good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the final University Grand Rounds of the academic year and our 8th annual Tile Lecture in Trauma. There will be an opportunity, I think, for questions at the end, so please use the Q&A rather than the chat box. Tile Lecture was named in recognition of Dr. Marvin Tile, who was the Surgeon-in-Chief at Sunnybrook between 1985 and 95. He's the world authority on the treatment of pelvic and acetabular trauma, was past president of the AO Foundation in Switzerland, and has been named to the Order of Canada for his contributions in clinical surgery, teaching, and research. With his vision, Dr. Tile set us on the right path for trauma care in Toronto as early as 1976, with the establishment of Canada's first trauma center at Sunnybrook. A lot's changed since then, with now strong collaborations across our 3 trauma centers, but it all began with Dr. Tile, who will be recognized for 55 years of service to Sunnybrook this year. So amazing. The Tile Lecturer is an outstanding physician or injury scientist with an international reputation, and I know we met that bar today. Before I introduce our Tile Lecturer for 2021, I know Dr. Tile would probably like to say a few words. So Marv, take it from here.
Yeah, it gives me great pleasure first to be here with my wife, Esther, of 67 years, coming up next week. And several members of my family, I think, are tuned in. So Joe, welcome to Toronto. Avery, you're quite right. When I first came to Sunnybrook, I was a resident in 63. The hospital was a veterans hospital, no emerge, no ICU, no nothing. And by 76, we had the first trauma unit after huge problems with the government. One of the interesting things, you're speaking on gun control, we had to look south of the border in 76 when we opened to find a gunshot wound in Ontario or in Toronto. For the first several years, we basically had none. And we're catching up slowly, not quite, but slowly. So your subject is certainly an excellent one for this particular session. We and our family all look forward to hearing it. And again, welcome to our fair city, even on Zoom.
Thanks, Marvin. So it is my pleasure to introduce the Tile Lecturer for 2021, Dr. Joe Sakharine. He's currently the Director of Emergency General Surgery, Associate Professor of Surgery, and Associate Chief of the Division of Acute Care Surgery at the Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. With an inclination towards policy, he was named a Presidential Leadership Scholar, where he had an opportunity to learn from past US presidents, and was an RWJ Foundation Health Policy Fellow, providing him with the experience of working in the US Senate. Now, I can go on and speak further to his CV and academic accomplishments, but I prefer to go a little off script. I've had the chance to work closely with Dr. Sakharine over the past 5 years through the American College of Surgeons, and I would say without question, he's one of the most principled and passionate individuals I've ever met. When you combine these 3 Ps, principles, passion, and political astuteness, you have an agent of change. Dr. Sakharine is an ideal example of how we as surgeons can make a difference through advocacy and ultimately affect changes in policy, how we might follow a path and with the 3 Ps, take that path wherever it might lead us. I've been inspired by Dr. Sakharine, and I'm sure you will be too. Dr. Sakharine, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Nathans, for that generous introduction. It really is a true honor to be here with all of you, even if it is virtually. And let me just, can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Right, good. This is really a true honor, and I just want to, personally thank both the department and Dr. Tile, as well as Dr. Nathans, for the privilege of talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, especially on a day like today, which I think you couldn't have arranged it any better, because today is June 4th, which is National Gun Violence Awareness Day. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But before we get into that, I really just wanted to quickly recognize Dr. Tile, who I'm grateful is here with us today. And I think, you can look back as we heard Avery mention, all of the incredible work within orthopedics that have been done over his career. But I think, as I was telling him before this webinar started, one of the most impressive things to me is how he had the vision to understand the impact that he could have by focusing on the development of systems at a time when, frankly, people were not really thinking of this. And this led to Sunnybrook developing the first and largest trauma center in the country, as you all know, in 1976. And I think that type of dedication allowed, the delivery of trauma care to go beyond simply the operating room or the four walls of the hospital. And this is something that, in a different way, I've been trying to do. So it really is pretty remarkable. And thank you for the opportunity to be here and for all the work that you've done. I can't really begin talking about this topic without really telling you my own story. The son of immigrant parents, born just outside our nation's capital. And, I think my parents came to the States in search of those hopes and dreams that so many immigrant families are looking for. And what I would say is I had a relatively normal childhood, watching my parents wake up every morning and really trying to do everything possible to give us a life that they could never imagine. But I think one of the things that none of us in our family were really expecting is how our lives would change. When at the age of 17, I was nearly killed after being shot in the throat with a .38 caliber bullet. And so it's hard to really start this talk, or frankly, any talk about gun violence without sharing this story with you. And without really recognizing the two individuals, Dr. Bob Ahmed on the left, who was my trauma surgeon, and Dr. D. Mukherjee on the right, who was my vascular surgeon, who along with their teams provided me this second opportunity and this second chance at life. And I don't know how many of you were at 17, but I love this Brad Paisley song where he says, at 17, it's hard to see past Friday night. And I think what he means there is that most of us at that age have no idea what we want to do in our life, let alone appreciate the fact that we're mortal. And I think I was very much of that mindset. And I remember coming out of the hospital, I had a tracheostomy tube. I had these beet red scars up and down my neck. And I remember standing in the mirror one morning, and I was looking in the mirror, and what I didn't realize is my father was in the corner. And I think when he looked in, he saw the look of devastation in my eyes. And he walked in and he said something that I'll just never forget. He said, "Listen, Joe, what happened to you was terrible. But you really have two options. The first is you can decide to feel sorry for yourself." And I think that was typical, tough love from a dad, especially an immigrant father that, came from nothing. But the second is you can take this horrible incident and try to turn it into something that impacts the lives of other people. And it was really that moment that really turned things around for me in how I thought about this second chance. And as I look back at it now, in many ways, it seems like the worst moment of my life also has turned out to be the most impactful, because it led me down this path that I had never imagined. And after, I had the chance to, finish medical school, I got this really unique opportunity to go back and train at Inova Fairfax Hospital, where I had been a patient at. And it's hard to articulate what it's like to train with the people that actually saved your life. It's an experience that I still haven't figured out a good way to put into words. And after I left Fairfax, I was really privileged to go to the Trauma Center at Penn, where I really then began to understand not just the delivery of care to critically injured patients, but also, as we were talking about in Dr. Marvin's accomplishments, how do you develop systems so you can take care of regions and states and the nation in a way that ensures, regardless of where you're injured or when you're injured, you have timely access to high quality care. And this is something else I think that the University of Pennsylvania, under the leadership of so many incredible individuals, including Dr. Schwab, really helped, I think, put in the back of my mind. And as I started to think about our role as trauma surgeons, I really was taken back to an experience and a motto that stuck in my head when I was at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and that was protecting health, saving lives millions at a time. And I think this represents both the opportunity and the responsibility that we have as clinicians, as people that take care of injured patients, to think beyond the operating room and beyond the trauma center, because as many of us know, the best medical treatment is often prevention. And one thing kind of led to another, and I started to ask myself the question of how do I work at this intersection of medicine, public health, and public policy, because I started to realize the importance of policy and how policy can help us as healthcare professionals shape the future of medicine and how we approach these senseless tragedies. And it's what took me to the Kennedy School, where I really developed kind of a broad-based understanding from a theoretical perspective. And then I kept asking myself the question, well, how does it actually functionally happen? What is the practicality of it? And that's why last fall I had made my way from the operating room to the Hart Senate office building, where I knew then, as I know even better now, that as a healthcare worker and a public health expert, I needed to better understand federal policy and how federal policy was made in America, and to understand why it wasn't as simple as I thought it should be. And I really, was thinking about how do I learn how to tackle these complex health problems, such as gun violence, and how our healthcare system could better serve all Americans, not just those who could afford it. Now, I served in the office of Senator Maggie Hassan, who happens to serve in both the Help Committee and the Finance Committee. And these are two very unique committees because both of these committees essentially comprise all of the healthcare jurisdiction in America. And so I joined as part of both her education team and her health policy team. And this was right before COVID happened. So you can imagine how things quickly turned around once the pandemic really took off. I just want to say that, I'm here obviously because of a lot of hard work, but primarily also because of the people I have in my life. And I think all of us, we have these individuals that are truly, not just mentors, but they're sponsors. They're individuals that allow us to be the best version of ourselves possible. And I'm just incredibly grateful to them. Just a couple of quick disclosures. The first is, I am a victim of gun violence. And I put this as a disclosure because, as we all try to be as objective and as honest as possible. But I think we have to recognize the implicit bias that exists in each and every one of us. And so that's why I put that up there. I'm a board member at Brady. And like many of you, I care for injured patients. So this is personal. We'll quickly talk about, the kind of the scope of the problem. And a lot of this is US centered and focused, but there are some international examples that I'm going to give. And then we're going to talk about some of the current challenges moving forward. And we're going to end in a little bit of a different way. And I'm so glad to have Dr. Ahmed on the phone with us, because part of what we're going to end with is telling your story. And I think she's done such a great job of doing this in Canada and beyond. So, you know, this is a picture when I was in the fire department. And some of you are probably looking at this picture and you're probably wondering what in the world is going on. There is Joe, you know, posing for a picture as the building behind him burns down. And I show this just to make the point that perception is not always reality. This was a training exercise where we had come out of the building and the other team had gone in. And I mentioned this specifically as it relates to this topic, because when we're talking about emotionally charged issues, I think we have to remember to really listen and listen with the intent to understand. And if you can think about how many times you've been in a meeting and you hear someone that says something that you really don't agree with. Well, if you think about what happens in that scenario, well, you stop listening to them. And as you know, 90% of communication is nonverbal. So they stop listening to you. And communication breaks down, not just for that one moment, but for future interactions, because you remember that's the person that said something I really didn't agree with. And so I think when we're talking about these topics, these issues, we really have to kind of suspend our judgment and understand all of the different facets, because these are very complex. When Bill Schwab gave his presidential address for East, he called, you know, violence is America's uncivil war. And unfortunately, I think not a lot has changed. In fact, in some aspects, it's gotten even worse. A lot of you are probably familiar with some of these statistics where in the US, over 300 people are shot a day with over 100 deaths. Now, the deaths, of course, are incredibly important to capture, but I would submit to you that the non-fatal injuries are just as important, if not even more important, because right now it's about 2 to 3 non-fatal injuries per death. And those estimates are conservative. Why are they conservative? Because depending upon the state that you live in or the hospital that you're a part of, you may or may not capture all of these non-fatal injuries. And these non-fatal injuries, in my mind, provide an opportunity, right? Because we know the recidivism rate in some communities are as high as 50%. And that's why, you know, studies like this, where Dr. Nathans is actually the co-PI of, where the American College of Surgeons was awarded a grant from the National Collaborative on Gun Violence Research to look at non-fatal firearm injuries. And I'm proud to say they have over 200 trauma centers that are enrolled. So this is going to be a very important study to really understand the circumstances and the risk factors of both adult and pediatric firearm injuries. Like I said, you know, the pediatric group is also impacted. And I'll just say that it may not be a surprise to many of you that 1 out of 3 children have guns in the home, right? There's nearly 400 million firearms in America. But I think what all of us should be surprised at, and what any responsible gun owner will tell you, is that there should never be, you know, the situation where you have children in homes with loaded and unlocked weapons. And we know that in America, 4.6 million children live in a home with an unlocked and loaded gun. When you look at the breakdown as it relates to deaths, one of the aspects that often gets dismissed is suicide. And suicide actually comprises 2/3 of deaths in America. And the other big chunk are homicides, and then you have unintentional injury and so forth. You'll notice I did not use the term accident. I try to never use that. None of these are accidents. When you use the term accident, you imply it's not preventable. And I think from a public health perspective, you know, words really do matter. I think it's important to also look at this homicide rate by age, gender, and race. And when you initially take a look at this, you know, slide, you might say, oh, well, okay, it's not too bad, 4.5 per 100,000, right? When you look at all comers. Well, what happens when you look at white males? Well, that number drops down even lower. Okay, well, we know disease is of, you know, young people, especially gun violence. So what happens when we look at young white males? Okay, that number goes up pretty significantly. But what happens if we look at black males? Okay, goes up even more dramatically. What about young black males? So I show this here to demonstrate the disparity that exists as it relates to not just gender, but also to race. And this is critical, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a few minutes. Now, the number of gun murders per capita in the US, when you look at this, you can see here that it's pretty significant as it relates to where we stand as a nation. Canada is not too far behind. Another way to think about this is by looking at this kind of comparison. And this is data from 2019. And essentially what you can see here is that this is looking at gun-related killings, right, as a percent of all homicides. And you can see here that in the US, it's 73%. Canada, it's 39%. Now, in 2020, we had over 615 mass shootings that resulted in at least 500 deaths and over 2,500 wounded. I'll say that in 2021, we haven't really done much better. This is a picture I took from last month off of CNN that was trying to demonstrate what's been happening across the country. And when you look at some of the mass shootings that we've experienced, you can see how deadly they are, with Las Vegas really being the top with 58 people killed. And what's interesting is when you look at mass shootings, which we define as 4 or more people injured or killed, what's very clear to me and to many of us that do research and work in this space is that this is just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, mass shootings represent less than 2% of the overall public health problem. And when you look specifically at mass shootings, we know that it is, more common to see these semi-automatic rifles that are utilized. And what's important is when you look at this data, people say, well, if you ban these assault weapons, are you actually going to see a difference? Because 90% of homicides plus are committed by handgun. So you have to look at the data very carefully, and you have to look at this problem holistically and understand that, like any other public health problem, there is no one solution, right? It requires a multifaceted approach. And specifically as it relates to, these active shooter incidents and these mass shootings, there is some data to suggest that when you do have these incidents, when you have these semi-automatic, rifles, the AR-15s and so forth that are used, that both the number of people killed and those wounded, right, is much higher. And the reason mass shootings, in my mind, are so critical is because they take up a significant amount of media attention. Now, in some ways, this has been good because it's allowed us to elevate the topic for Americans and for people across the globe. But in many ways, it's also doing a disservice to the overall burden of disease that we're facing. And I often remember this moment when our colleague, Dr. Andre Campbell from San Francisco General, had come out after the YouTube shooting. And when he came out, he was surprised to see so many cameras and the media there. And he said to them, where were you yesterday when we had 4 African-American men that were brought in? And I think this just underscores the fact that, this is not a one-off problem. We have young Black men that are being slaughtered on our streets in cities like Baltimore, Chicago, Philadelphia, and that's happening on a daily basis. And so we have to do a better job of being able to tell those stories. This is a piece, that we published a while back, really trying to frame this in, a public health approach, because this is so critical. And we're going to talk more about this. But one of the other things that we talked about was, what I call this myth of mental health. And I think that when you look at violence in general, only 4% of violence actually is associated with one of the major mental illnesses, whether it's bipolar disease, schizophrenia, or major depression. And that's important because people who have mental illness are actually more likely to be victims rather than perpetrators. Now, we know that as you talk about suicides, there is this correlation between suicide and mental illness, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Since 2007, we know that suicide has been going up, right? Now, this is very different than when you look at the trend for homicide, which in general had been trending down over the past 2 decades up until about 2017, where we saw the number peak up. I think it's a little bit early to say what's going to happen with that number, right? We're going to have to wait for a few more years, but it looks like it's staying steady, if not increasing in different aspects. But when you look at the overall trends in this increasing suicide trend and this lower homicide trend, the actual overall level stays about the same because they balance each other out. And the suicide piece is so critical because it's a very different type of population. When we're talking about suicides in general, the majority of the burden is in older white men. We also know there are different demographics where people are impacted, such as veterans, where we lose 22 veterans a day to suicide, and nearly 70%, or 15 out of 22, are through the method of a firearm. Now, you may ask, well, why is that method so important? Why am I focusing on that? Well, when you look at people that have survived after a suicide attempt, what we know is that those individuals do not go on to die from a second attempt. In other words, those individuals go on living relatively normal lives, just like most of us. And so when you look at why the method is so important, you can see here that over 50% of the fatal suicide attempts are individuals that attempted suicide with a firearm. Because we know that the case fatality rate is incredibly high, above 95%. And when you look at like epidemiological trends, this was just published, this is a cross-sectional study, and it was, suicide appears to be the most common cause of firearm injury death in the US. And what's really interesting about this is that most people never actually reach the hospital. And I think this is important because this is one of the reasons I think for as healthcare professionals, sometimes this is out of sight, out of mind, because often we may not be seeing these people coming through our trauma bay. The other important piece is that when you look at individuals who decide to attempt suicide, what we know is that 70% will attempt within 1 hour from making the decision. And why is that important? Well, that's important because the time to intervene is probably not after they've made the decision. And we'll talk a little bit about this and how this relates to some policy pieces. Now, there are some ways that you can look at mental health as it relates to firearm. This is a study we published in the Annals of Surgery with Dr. Joseph and other colleagues that really looked at the effect of the different types of firearms on readmission, looking at acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress. And we found that the overall incidence was about 9%. We found also that there are predictors of readmission, those that were younger, those of female gender, those that had substance use, and those that were involved in assault. So there are some correlations as it relates to mental health, but usually that's after people are being injured. Now, the other piece that often gets dismissed or not focused on a lot is intimate partner violence. And we know that this is incredibly significant. In fact, the risk of homicide by firearm in this study was 2 times as high, and the risk of suicide was 15 times higher than women who did not purchase a gun. And what we know is that if you have individuals, right, perpetrators who have a firearm, it increases the risk of murder by 500%. And in fact, every 16 hours, we have one woman who is fatally shot. So I'm hoping that, by now we can see that there are so many different facets of this issue. And for each of those pieces, the solutions may be a little bit different. Now, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, this past year in COVID and what's happened. We saw an incredible surge in the sale of firearms. And, we see this in a variety of different, scenarios, whether it's the protest or, whether a mass shooting happens, right? You can see these trends that overall happen. And there's been some interesting work that's been done looking at how, some of the COVID pandemic policies really impacted firearm injury. And this was a piece that was just published in JACS that looked at the social isolation policies and found that they were associated with an increased intentional injury, especially gun violence. Now, if the human toll is not enough, I tell you that there's also an economic burden. This was a piece we published in Health Affairs. This actually came out the day after the Las Vegas mass shooting. And we tried to look at cost and charges. And for those of you that have looked at these numbers, you know how difficult it is to look at the economic burden. But what we found in patients that were brought to the emergency department and discharged, and those that were admitted, is that there was a mean charge of about $5,000 for those that were discharged and about $100,000 for those that were admitted, which leaves kind of an annual burden of around $3 billion. Now, what's important to understand from these numbers is that we're just talking about hospital charges. We're not talking about the societal impact, right? The need to stay on a ventilator for the rest of your life, the ability to reintegrate and to get back into work, right? To be a productive part of society. And when you look at some of these different studies, there's some that have predicted it at 174 billion, which that in and of itself, right, is more than we're spending to educate our kids. And there's some more recent work done out of Everytown's research group that predicts this at $280 billion. So the economic burden is significant. Now, when you look at the public policy approach, it's very complicated, as I think all of you have probably seen. And one of the things that we kind of go back and forth in is people say, well, guns are part of our culture. And this was a great book that was written by Adam Winkler called Gunfight. And he talks about this polarization of the topic and this kind of regulation versus this right. And I think the reality is when you look historically at how we have treated firearms in the past, it's not similar to how you may see it in some Western movies where people just came into towns. In fact, in many Western towns, you would have to check in your firearms with the sheriff when you entered. And so, I think this kind of plays into this, us versus them, regulation versus right. And it's important we get beyond that, because the reality is there's a lot of commonality that exists among us as Americans. And often that we don't get to see that because of these kind of back and forth arguments that happen. We also know that when you look at Americans in general, there is significant support for a lot of different aspects of common sense gun legislation. One example being background checks. And you can see this was done in 2015. So this is a little bit older data where there was 84% of both gun owners and non-gun owners that supported things like expanding background checks. Now, that number is even higher. This is a Fox News poll that shows over 90% of Americans favor it. Yet, despite all of this, we've had very difficult time moving that needle forward, and we're going to talk a little bit as to why that is. I think as we think about this problem from a public health perspective, I often use this example of motor vehicles because I think it's a very good one. When you look at what happened in the 60s and in the 70s, where we had high fatality rates, we didn't just say, okay, let's get rid of cars, right? We, came up with seatbelts and airbags, and we figured out how to make roads safer, right? It's this transition from trying to simply focus on human behavior, which we know in and of itself is not cost effective, but to really develop a system, right, similar to what Dr. Tile did in the 70s, that allows us to ensure that people are less likely to be injured and more likely to be taken care of in a timely manner. And I think when you look at this, you really have to look at this from a full perspective of this biopsychosocial disease, right? So it's this complex public health issue that has a biological problem, that has a behavioral problem, and that has a social problem. And this is a term that Dr. Hargaard and others have used to really kind of underscore this issue. I had the privilege of working as part of the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program on the Safe Storage Toolkit that was really focused on healthcare professionals. And one of the reasons that this has been really something that has been so important to me, because I think when you look at all of us as clinicians, and you look at us across, at least here in the US, across the states, there are a variety of reasons as to why we don't talk to our patients about gun violence prevention. I think some of it relates to the fact that we maybe didn't grow up with a firearm in the home, and maybe we don't feel comfortable talking about it. Or maybe there's socio-geographical differences, right? Where, you're in, Texas is very different than if you're in Boston, Massachusetts. So what this toolkit and what this whole approach is trying to do is really empower clinicians with the knowledge and the skills to objectively talk about this issue in a way that is not judgmental, but is simply based in data, science, and prevention. And, part of, our role is also to empower our patients and their families. And we talked a little bit about, the suicide piece and how, trying to react or act after someone has made the decision is probably too late. And it's why legislation like this, like the extreme risk protection orders, which are also known as red flag laws, I think are so important, because these pieces of legislation allow families and law enforcement to temporarily suspend a person's access to firearms through due process, of course. And this is so important because who knows your loved one better than their family and friends? And we have seen numerous examples of how this has worked. Now, it's not enough to simply pass the legislation, right? You have to pass the legislation, but you also have to educate the public on how to use it and the fact that they can actually execute it. And we've seen examples in states like California where they have extreme risk protection order, but people weren't aware of it and didn't know how to implement it. When you look at, I just got a haircut when I was coming back from vacation. When you look at how many states license professional haircutters, now, if I was in front of you, I'd ask you all to raise your hands, but you can imagine that all states require this. And when you look at the states in which a firearm dealer's license is required, you can see the drastic difference. And I just want to spend a second focusing on the permit and the license and why that's so important, because it does a couple things. The first is it typically requires an application to law enforcement, which when you think about this, right, this is so critical because this is going to detract bad actors from, having to go down to the police station and fill out the application. The other piece is it often allows more time for a background check. So some of you probably know that in the US, if the background check does not come back in 3 days, the dealer has to sell you the firearm, right? Versus like waiting until it comes back. And so this, again, allows for more time. The third piece is there's typically a fingerprinting component, which, as you may imagine, is more accurate than simply giving your name and birthday. And then in some states, there are requirements for verification of safety training. So you can see why this would be a critical piece to all of this. When you look at why is it so difficult to change gun policy, at least at the federal level here in the US, I think it comes down to two things. The first is the structure of the government. And the reality is in the Senate, you need 60 votes, right, to pass legislation. And then the second is the effectiveness of the gun lobby. And we have seen this, in so many different ways, but I think the best example is after Citizens United decision, the Supreme Court decision that came down in 2010, which essentially allowed, after that unlimited amounts of indirect, spending. And you can see what happened to that line after that decision. Now, most recently, it's been interesting, and these are figures from the Center for Responsive Government, but that looked at people that were spending on gun rights versus gun control. And you can see how things have changed. Of course, some of you are aware that in 2021, the NRA filed for bankruptcy as part of a fraud case against some of its own senior staff. When I look at all this, I had, the chance and the privilege to spend this past year in the US Senate. And I think my time there really left me with 3 lessons, which I recently published in the Annals of Surgery. But the first is that us as healthcare professionals, we are so critical to this policymaking process, right? And I think what I've learned over time is it's not just about the people who have the right ideas, but also about the strategy and the approach that you take to execute those ideas. And then, the third piece that I think may be even hard to hear in such divisive times is the fact that it is important to have bipartisanship. And the diversity of ideas, I think, and I was able to see firsthand, really allow us to get to better policymaking, and it's better for the nation, whether it's here in America or Canada. Many of us as scientists and as researchers, we focus on this kind of importance of research and how it's all played out. And you really have to go back to Art Kellerman's publications in the New England Journal in the mid-90s, where he showed that the availability of a firearm is associated with increased risk of suicide and homicide. And this really got the attention of the NRA. And it's what led to the Dickey Amendment, which I think many of you are aware of. But the Dickey Amendment wasn't the only thing that happened. In fact, what else happened was this ability where they shifted $2.6 million, right, from gun violence research to traumatic brain injury. And that money is not a random amount. That was the amount that had been spent the year prior. So it sent a very clear message to folks that, listen, like, you better stop focusing on this, even though the actual amendment didn't say they couldn't research the etiology of gun violence. Even after President Obama issued the executive order, there's always been this back and forth as to whether or not they could study it. And when you look at some of the different grants that have been awarded over the years, you can see some of these very rare diseases and the type of grants that they have awarded. And if you look at firearm injury, you can see the disparity that exists. Now, this is before, of course, they allocated and appropriated $25 million in the last cycle, which was the first time in over 20 years that Congress had appropriated dollars. And it's pretty sad, because when you think about a lot of these common sense measures that we're talking about and what individuals like President Obama tried to push, many of these, I think almost all of us would be in favor of. And so these aren't, off the cuff, ridiculous ideas. These are just ideas that really will provide a more comprehensive approach to making communities safer. And we've seen how other nations, of course, have dealt with this, like Australia in the mid-90s, where they had the Port Arthur massacre. The difference is that, the prime minister at the time, John Howard, was able within 2 weeks to pass a national firearm agreement that did a variety of different things. Now, whether or not these pieces would appropriately work in a place like the US can be up for discussion, but the point is that they decided to act. And when you look at what's happened since 1996, you can see that the homicide rate as it relates to guns dropped by 59% and the suicide rate to 65%. Now, these are not causation, these are associations. So I'll let you make your own assumptions. Now, we also saw New Zealand after the mosque shooting and how the prime minister acted in a very swift way to, again, pass sweeping legislation. So other countries have, been very different in how they've responded to these horrific and senseless tragedies. I will say that I think that when you look at our country, times are changing. And the reality is that, we have seen in the past 2 presidential cycles, especially in this past cycle, individuals like President Biden running on a platform of gun violence prevention. And that's kind of unheard of if you think historically, they didn't want to even approach this topic. So the needle has been moving forward. And I think part of it has to do with us as healthcare professionals. This is a great piece by Dr. Goldberg from Temple, who talks about this apolitical profession of trauma surgeons waking up and speaking out about this issue. And many of you probably know that in 2018, the NRA came after us as healthcare professionals, and this is what led to the whole "This Is Our Lane" movement, where they said that we didn't have a role to play as it relates to gun violence in America. And we, of course, responded very swiftly. I think one of the reasons we did is because we were incensed at the fact that an individual or an organization would think that we don't have a role to play when we're at front and center of taking care of these patients day in and day out. And it's what led to the first medical summit on firearm injury prevention at the college, which we came out with a number of different public health interventions. But what was also very unique about this is this was the first time that it really brought together 44 different medical organizations across the nation in solidarity to really say, listen, we have a role to play and we have to address this issue. Now, it's not just in the US. Dr. Ahmed has been incredibly vocal and active on this issue in Canada and has done a tremendous job. So I highly suggest you follow some of the work that she's done. Well, today is National Gun Violence Awareness Day. So it's like a perfect day to have this talk in many ways. And I just want to end in a little bit of a different way, and that's about telling your story. Now, when I first started talking about this, I think a lot of people, especially surgeons, thought this was a little bit too foo-foo. And they're, didn't really, I think, appreciate the importance of these soft skills. And I really, I think, learned a lot about this at my time at the Kennedy School, where probably the world expert in public narrative, Marshall Gans, talks about the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. And I think, one of the things and one of his main points is that if you want to go from value, whatever that value is, right, which is your purpose, it's your why. If you want to go from value to action, it's not done through, telling people the data and the science. It's done through emotion. It's done through being able to translate that data and science into something that's relatable. Now, I don't mean to dismiss the importance of the data and science, but the data and the science alone do not change the hearts and minds of people. And so it's critical to understand this concept. Other people like Simon Sinek have talked about this, where they talk about the why, the how, and the what. And his point here is that, when you look at successful companies, they don't buy into how you do something. They buy into why you do it. So if you can get people to believe in what they believe in, then you've won them over. I just want to say that, since Parkland, we've had over 1,200 kids shot and killed every year. And I think all of us can agree that's unacceptable. And when you look at young people, I've been very proud of what young people have done in this country, where they've really, I think, shown us a path that, frankly, we should have been leading for them. And they've really kind of changed my perspective. And it really got me thinking about my own story. And when I really even understood the power of my own story, which I thought, who would care about, my history or my background? And it really happened when I was at the University of Pennsylvania, where we would take these young teenagers and give them a tour of the trauma center. And after we give them a tour of the trauma center, I would talk to them about gun violence. And the first time I did this, I, hadn't told them my story yet. And I was talking to them about gun violence. And, they're kind of paying attention, but not really, right? They're 14, 15-year-old teenagers. And then when I told them my story, all of a sudden their eyeballs focused on me. So it was a reaction that I had never seen before and one that I wasn't expecting. But I think what it told me in that moment was that I went from being this guy wearing a white coat to someone that could relate to what these kids were facing in their communities day in and day out. And so, I think that all of us have to determine, not just if you're in public life, how to tell our own story. When you look at these kids, it doesn't need a caption because they've done such an incredible job of telling their story. So I just want to leave you with, number one is like, what's your story? Really think about this. When I tell my medical students, hey, what's your story? They often say, I'm a third-year medical student on the surgery rotation and so forth. By the end of the rotation, their answer is very different, right? Your story is not your CV. Your story is the why. I love what I do. And I just think what a privilege it is to have the opportunity to have people trust us in taking care of them and providing life-saving care. And despite how much I love what I do, I think the worst part of my job is having to talk to these moms, dads, and these loved ones and tell them that their child that left that morning is not coming home again. And I just, always remember this 17-year-old kid that I took care of not too long ago that had a devastating traumatic brain injury. And I had to go up to the ICU to talk to his mom to explain to her that, her son was never coming home again. And as I walked up to the ICU, I could see her there behind the glass doors, holding her son's hand. And I knew that what I was about to do was going to completely change her life. And as I, walked in there with my team, I began explaining to her the devastating injury that her son had. And she began telling me about her son, how he was the first in their family to graduate from high school, which in Baltimore, especially in the African-American community, is a big deal. And he was also, had these hopes and dreams of going to college, none of which will ever come true. And as she was telling me this, she looked up and I think she saw how, devastated we were as a team. And she walked over and she did something I'll never forget. She put her hand on my shoulder and she said, "Are you okay?" And I just want you to think about that for a second. Here's a mom that just lost her son and she's asking us if we're okay. And I think it's moments like that which restore my faith in humanity. And it's moments like that which get me to wake up every morning to just try to do everything possible and fight tirelessly to end these senseless tragedies and make communities safer. I have the opportunity to be here with you, but really it's my partners who are keeping the patients front and center of what we do that the credit goes to. And I'm grateful for them being there for our patients and just grateful for all the mentors in my life. So thank you so much. And thanks to Dr. Tile and the rest of the department for this incredible opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Saccharin. Truly a very inspiring story. There's a couple of questions and well, let's try to get to them. But before we do so, I'm wondering whether you can just highlight for many of our residents who are actually listening, many are very passionate about their causes and have found it challenging to advocate. How does someone acquire the skills to be able to do what you've done?
Well, I can tell you it's a great question and one that I get asked a lot. When I was going through this, I had no idea. Like when I went to medical school and training, I had no idea I was going to be doing what I'm doing today. And I only realized it because I started to understand that, like that 17-year-old kid, it doesn't matter how good of a doctor I was, how good of a health system I was in. The best medical treatment that could have saved that kid's life is prevention. And so it made me realize that I had to do things differently. And so I didn't naturally have those skills. I had to develop them. I had to understand, like we were talking about at the end, like the importance of telling your story and how do you, take a stat like 40,000 deaths a year and translate it into something that can actually resonate. So what I first started doing was writing, stories out, experiences out. Like every day I would journal. And you'll be surprised that if you do that with all your clinical interactions, over time, you're going to see all these incredible experiences. And then taking that and being able to formulate that in ways that can actually connect with other people, because other people are going to have similar experiences. that's how I started doing it. And I'm a work in progress. I mean, I continue to try to improve and try to get better every day and try to figure out, part of it is timing, right? When, as you've seen, when like mass shootings happen, that's a very good time to try to elevate your stories and try to elevate the issue. So it's a combination of those factors. And then of course, finding incredible mentors that can help you do it in a way that allows you to maintain your objectivity, which I think is so important as healthcare professionals. I'm very cognizant about having the moral courage to be able to speak up, but also ensuring that I do it in a way that is objective and as data-driven as possible.
Okay, just two quick questions again, because we're out of time. Do you think with the NRA now in a little bit of a weakened state with the proceedings moving forward, do you think that's an opportunity? Is that going to allow for some policy change? And the second question before we end would be, what's your perspective on Hollywood's portrayal of gun violence and gun culture? Has that been a contributor?
Yeah, great question. So in regards to the first question, I think, look, a lot of us get frustrated because we haven't seen significant federal change here in the US. But I think one thing that is very important to point out is that in America, most governing happens at the state and the local level. And in fact, when you look at states across the US, there's been, in 2018, there was like 67 pieces of legislation that were passed. And part of that has to do with communities, not just healthcare professionals, but different disciplines coming out and advocating for those type of changes. Over time, that's resulted in also is, I think, weakening of the NRA because the paradigm has shifted, right? The needle has moved forward. And the NRA is not what it was 10, 15 years ago. In fact, if you look in 2008, there were 63 democratically elected members of Congress that had an A rating by the NRA. In 2018, that number was 3, and I think it's even lower now. So the country is shifting, and I think they've become weaker because people realize this is not about, the problem are not responsible gun owners, right? The problem is that the NRA and the gun lobby have leaders that are not willing to represent their actual membership, right? The members of the NRA, right, these responsible gun owners actually agree with a lot of the different measures that we talk about. In regards to the second piece of your question about Hollywood, it's very interesting because this has been a topic that many of us have discussed, and we think that there is a potential role that they have played over the years with all the violence that we're seeing. We just finished a production in Hollywood where I was serving as the COVID consultant, and we were having this actual discussion about, well, how do we minimize that? And it's very difficult to kind of break those barriers. So we've been trying to work with producers and with studios to figure out what can we do to send a message of gun violence prevention while allowing them to stay accurate to the stories that they're trying to tell. And that's one of the comments that we've got, like this production we just did was based on a true story. So they wanted, the reality of the story to be, front and center. And that meant using firearms in that film. So I don't have a good answer as to how we transcend those challenges, except for continuing to have those conversations and to try to insert aspects of prevention throughout because they have such a powerful platform.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Saccharin. I know that there's other questions, and I hope you don't mind if some of us reach out to you after this by email. But I do want to thank you for carrying the flag and being such an effective advocate for change. And I wish you the best. You did mention you got a haircut. We're still waiting to get our haircuts here in Ontario.
I know it's tough. Well, I hope things turn around soon. And again, thanks so much, Dr. Nathans and Dr. Tom Rutka and the rest of the team. It's really such an honor to be here. I'm sorry that I went over a few minutes.
Take care and thanks again.
Bye-bye.